Hi there. Today is April 24th, 2019, and because Monday was Easter Monday, the regular OpenMRS Flow design call meeting was canceled, and so this is a brief video update on some of the changes from last week, just to keep everyone involved in the project up to speed. On the issue of user interface design, we continue to work on the core component library. And so if you open that document, you'll now find that it's been rewritten to make it a bit easier to see this high-level summary. It explains that there's generally two parts to this application we're considering: the more generic application component and a more specific patient file. And for safety, you would only be able to have, let's say, one patient file open at one time. And so within the application, and you can review this in more detail yourself, you'll find generic components which you'll be able to, for instance, search for a patient, have different list component types, such as a patient list or a clinic queue or a unit list. And then these lists will render a patient summary card, which is a summary snippet. And then by selecting that patient summary card, it will then open up the patient file. And the patient file has two halves to it. There is more of this part we're calling a patient chart, and something which is being called more a patient workflow. And all this nomenclature is, of course, up in the air, and you could suggest better alternatives. But the general idea is that the patient chart is more of a standardized part of the patient file, where it shows historical information, medication lists and such. And the patient workflows is a much more customizable part of the application, built more for specific use cases, specific users, and specific workflows. And so you can review the components which you might be able to bring into a workflow. A workflow might have a certain amount of hierarchy, such as the ability to have a page and sections within that page. And then you'll also find that we have examples of the patient chart components. And so the patient chart might have, for instance, 5 major tabs: patient information, summary, timeline, therapies, notes, results. Of course, all this is still up in the air, but this is to give some very high-level groupings of the types of information and pre-built components which should be part of a standard patient chart. And then that workflow would be able to access a wide component library of components that you could use to build workflows as needed. And so, as I was mentioning, the workflows themselves, you can have a certain hierarchy of putting these components into pages, sections, and panels. And of course, being able to use either generic data capture components, such as short text fields or long text fields. You might be able to access generic data display components, such as displaying information in a list or in a 2-axis grid or table. But the thought, or you might be able to upload particular documents using standardized upload templates. But the thought would be that most of the components that a user selects to build their workflows would actually be part of the pre-built clinical workflows components. And so some of those examples of components might be patient history components. So you might have a component for asking questions about what language they speak, or about smoking history or alcohol history. So I would consider this just to be the very high-level outline. Within each of these items, such as occupation, you might have a component which is a standard set of questions that you can select from to ask about occupational questions. And each component, of course, is linked both to the user interface, it's linked to the concept dictionaries, and it's linked to the database. Some other components you might require would be clinical summaries, lists of therapies. Of course, this is all still very much up in the air and flexible, needs to be revised. Under physiology, you might have components specific to vital signs, such as pulse, heart rate, blood pressure. Each of these could be its own component, and you could bring in the component by itself, or you might bring in a whole panel of several of these components which are commonly lumped together, such as vitals. You might lump each of these individual components into a common panel. orders, results components, and then you get into more specialized component types, such as those unique to clinical decision support, to patient communication, to clinic tools such as appointment scheduling components, or components which help with creation of new patients or patients who are deceased. And then in the future, you might need to build components for other types of EHR care functions, such as supply chain management, equipment management, human resource management, billing, finance, patient health records, bulk scheduling features, and hospital features. This is, again, just the second draft of this component list, and it's very much a work in progress. Feel free to add in further details or commentary. The next step will be twofold. It will be to expand this list as well as to give details. So for instance, in the component for, let's say, patient vital signs, what would be the, for a heart rate component, what would be the data which you might want to request, and what would be the data that type of component would eventually submit or write to the database. And it would be nice if we could map these components using FHIR standards and standard terminology concept dictionaries such as Open Concept Lab to help make these components as reusable as possible. So those are the updates on the component library. This conversation pairs well into the conversation that was also happening on the thread OpenMRS UI UX Toolkit. So this thread was started back in September 2018, and then most recently, and it was around this concept of creating a set of reusable forms, cards, pages, and dashboards, kind of a library of components that can be used. The updates in the last week was that a conversation was had last week with the design firm Dahlberg, exploring initial interest if they might be willing to collaborate and work on some of the initial development of such a toolkit, as well as further conversations have gone on with Medic Mobile about their ability to help work with OpenMRS in the development of this type of a toolkit. And I think it's important to realize that these conversations which are happening around user interface design and around collaborating on common medical record system toolkits are conversations which are in some ways separate from discussions around the technical architecture and collaboration on that issue. Certainly, organizations may be able to collaborate on both the UX and the technologic architecture, but there's, I think, a lot of opportunity to collaborate just on the user interface design. For instance, coming up with these libraries of best practices for the use of user interface library components, which could be used potentially in different types of systems. And that conversation and community would be valuable, even separate if people are implementing those user interface best practices into their own technologic architectures. One other document which I would like to call your attention to is one which is evolving, and that's a document on best practices in user interface component design. This is a new document which is being shown for the first time this week, and it's an early scratchpad where I'm beginning to collect different groups which have published previously ideas for EHR component design, particular authors, researchers who have published in this area, official documentation such as from the NHS or from Australia regarding standards on best practices for user interface guidelines, and a lot of the material which is being developed on this paper here will ultimately be able to serve as the R&D for the greater component library. Moving on now to workflows and forms. There's no updates on that topic this week. And finally, we move to technological architecture, the technology. Last week, there was a conversation around the requirements from a technologic perspective that would be required in OpenMRS Flow. You can read that document if you haven't seen it. I think it's worth a read through, but there's been no new updates to that document. and we are awaiting a date with Medic Mobile where we can speak to them in more detail about the Community Health Toolkit. The conversation is twofold. It's partly to see if there might be the opportunity to actually collaborate with the Community Health Toolkit and see if that it could provide the right foundation to expand on to be able to provide the functionality that would be required for OpenMRS Flow. And if that may not be technologically possible, is to at least understand the best practices that they've designed in the development of their technology toolkit, which we might be able to use in building one which would apply for OpenMRS here. Most of the conversation, though, in the last week has been around there's also last week was conversation around what it would look like if we increased OpenMRS and went, quote, all in on FHIR. I think the takeaway of that conversation was that the end goal of OpenMRS is to ultimately align ourselves as close to FHIR as possible, both at the API level and in the database level. But the reality is that this is going to be a slow build out to get to that point. There's two things to consider. That probably a first step in moving towards a more FHIR-compatible OpenMRS is to expand the OpenMRS FHIR API, which already exists, and some concrete ways which we might think about expanding that FHIR API is potentially with Medic Mobile through expanding it to meet their needs in order to integrate better with their community health worker tools. There's other groups such as Connecting Kids with Care, which might be interested in expanding part of the OpenMRS FHIR API in order to better interchange data with their clinical system. And then as we look at OpenMRS Flow, there might be a need to expand the FHIR API to better serve resources to the user interface for OpenMRS Flow. So this is all areas for further development. But I think it's generally interesting to consider that the more that we expand the OpenMRS APIs and data structures to be FHIR compatible, it not only positions OpenMRS to be a electronic health record, but it also positions OpenMRS to be a really powerful data repository for global health informatics tools and systems, almost in some ways making it kind of a light version of a health information exchange, a FHIR-compatible data store, which different clinical systems are able to plug into to store their data and to push and pull data for their care needs. The very last area is on micro front-ends. This is where most of the conversation has happened this week. There are two talk threads of relevance. The first is the initial one that Burke started back in March on micro front-end architecture for OpenMRS. There's some back articles on micro front-ends to read on that discussion. This thread then continues in the Amazing Future of OpenMRS thread, where in the last week there's been further conversation with Joel Denning, who is the creator of SingleSpa, which is an example of a JavaScript framework, which is a micro front-end tool, which would allow you, in theory, to run both Angular and React applications on your same web browser at the same time. I think there's a lot of good slides which you can link out to from Joel's post, including a set of a slide deck for a front-end architecture for OpenMRS that is being suggested. The next meeting for the OpenMRS Flow project and just OpenMRS Design Forum in general will be on Monday, April 29th from 4 to 5 p.m. UTC, and the theme for that is modular front-end architecture for OpenMRS. So Joel Denning will be presenting on SingleSpa, and you can learn more from the links which have been provided in here. And there's also further conversation happening on the OpenMRS Slack channels, which are just slowly being jump-started again. Those are the updates for the week of April 24th, 2019. Please don't hesitate to contact me on Talk under Gregory Schmidt, or of course anyone else who's involved in the many exciting projects which are currently happening in the OpenMRS system. Thank you.